You see, the Americans, when they look at the Iranian regime, they see its links with Syria, they see its links with Hamas, they see its links with Hezbollah, and this is a challenge to American power in an absolutely critical, economically critical, geopolitically critical area of the globe, and it's that which is the sticking point for the American administration, in my view.
Just briefly, how bad could this get? We're hearing now the UK supported Washington's rhetoric, saying its warships are at the ready to prevent any attempt by Iran to hinder trade through that crucial Strait of Hormuz. Could this go further, do you think, develop into actual warfare?
Well, I think this is certainly in the minds of some of the players in the international community. We know that Israel, for instance, has had test flights out into the Mediterranean for exactly the same distance as there is between Tel Aviv and Tehran, with a view to having a strike on the nuclear facilities. And we know that even the Bush administration in its last months had to restrain the state of Israel from doing this. So we know that there are some people, hawks in Israel, hawks in the United States, who want to settle this militarily. And it does seem to me that once we begin on the process of implementing sanctions, of Iran responding to the sanctions, that there will be calls further down the road for a direct military conflict. And that, in this case, is even more dangerous than it was in the case of Iraq.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that. But I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. Of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
The whole world is saying Iran violate UN Security Council resolutions. They're continuing to race towards the development of nuclear bombs.
Canada has sparked international reaction after shutting its embassy in Tehran and pulling out all of its diplomats. The government says one of the reasons was that it feared for their safety, but that the move goes far beyond the staff in Tehran. According to Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird on Friday, Iran isn't just a threat to Canadian diplomats.
Canada views the government of Iran as the most significant threat to global peace and security in the world today.
For Baird, Iran is a global menace, and he's not alone.
Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability presents an intolerable threat to Israel, to America, and to the world.
We remain deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear program.
Right now, the biggest threat we're all facing is Iran's plans to develop nuclear weapons capability.
World leaders have repeatedly warned that they are willing to do anything to prevent Iran from getting the bomb, even go to war.
In the longer term, we take nothing off the table.
The President and I have said nothing is off the table.
When I say all options are at the table, I mean it.
So far, there's no proof Iran's nuclear program is anything but peaceful. But according to the UN, the country has dramatically increased the production of enriched uranium that could be used for a bomb. For Israeli leaders, that's proof enough. They now openly discuss attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities, and they expect the U.S. to back them up.
The United States is not certain whether or not Israel will strike Iran before the presidential elections.
Baird says he knows nothing about a strike against Iran, but with Canada's grievances with Iran going back years, many are asking, why cut ties now? To talk about this, we're joined by Janice Stein, director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. She's here in Toronto. In Washington, Aaron David Miller. He served 2 decades as an advisor to Republican and Democratic secretaries of state and as a scholar at the Wilson Center. And in New York, author Houman Majd. So, Janice, start with you. Why cut ties now?
3 reasons coming together, Wendy. One is, in fact, that our diplomats in Tehran, there were only 7. We had a charge d'affaires there, and they were totally shut out. They had no access to the Iranian government at all over the last several months. There are Iranian Canadians who are in jail. Our staff on the ground were absolutely unable to do anything for them, and the operation was costing $7 million. The department's in the midst of budget cutting. So there was some pressure there, but I don't think that's enough. The second reason, growing concern about what the Iranian embassy, which was one of the largest, was doing on the ground in Canada.
What do you mean?
Specifically, allegations growing in intensity that they were monitoring, that's a careful word, the activities of Iranian Canadians.
But that happens all the time, does it not? I mean,
it did.
It happened in the Libyan embassy, and even when we were sending planes over.
It did, but both of those were actually shut down, both the Libyan and the Syrian embassy, for that reason. And those complaints have become louder over the last several months. And the third reason, probably the icing on the cake, was the meeting of the non-aligned group in Tehran, in which large numbers showed up. And this probably was an attempt by the Harper government, which was displeased by Ban Ki-moon's attendance, to send a strong counter message.
What's your take on this, Houman? Why now?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's to do with the Ben Affleck movie coming out soon. Or, I mean, you know, that's. I mean, I say that. I don't mean to be flippant, but actually, if Canada is concerned about its diplomats in Iran, it is possible, given what happened to the British embassy back in November of last year, that a mob could attack the Canadian embassy over something as silly as a movie, about the Canadians rescuing American hostages back in 1979.
Will Iran care?
I'm not sure if that's a factor, but sorry.
But will it have any impact? Will Iran care?
No, it'll care from the PR standpoint a little bit, but no, not really. There's hardly any trade between Canada and Iran. Iran doesn't consider Canada a force in international affairs. I think if this is followed by, and it's possible that the Canadians did this knowing that it was going to be followed by some other Western alliance countries doing the same thing, then yes, Iran will care then, I think.
Well, that's the thing, I suppose.
On its own, no.
Aaron, we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu today saying that he wants a coalition. He's been talking to the U.S. about drawing this red line, suggesting that Canada's part of this, although that's not what John Baird said. What about that idea, that it's time to say there is this line, and if you cross it, then we'll perhaps attack you?
Well, I think if the international community was serious about actually creating a red line that had identifiable components that could actually be measured, there were metrics to determine whether or not Iran had crossed it, and then if in fact the Iranians did cross it on the nuclear issue, the international community acting together would actually respond.
Is that going to happen?
They've responded with sanctions. They've tried negotiations. The reality is, look, I don't want to trivialize the Israeli concerns. I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. I'm not sitting in downtown Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and listening to Iranian rhetoric on Israel as a cancer and Holocaust denial and an insult to humanity. But the reality is there's only one country in the world right now, in September 2012, that considers Iran an existential threat to Israel, and that requires a war of necessity, and that is Israel. The rest of the international community is looking for every conceivable way, seems to me, including the United States, I might add, to avoid a military confrontation. Certainly before the elections, our president, in that regard, is the not now president. He clearly does not want anything to happen before November. And I would argue he's not, his heart isn't in this one even between now and the end of the year. I think this is a 2013 problem, and I suggest to you that Netanyahu, constrained by the problems that any Israeli military operation would pose, that is to say, would it work given the risks? Number two, he can't get a consensus within his own country to act.
Okay, well, let me go to Janice here.
And number three's got the Americans telling him to be very careful. So I think he's looking for a way as well. The red line concept may be that way.
So, Janice, do you see anyone signing up for the red line coalition? And would that even work?
You know, Wendy, the problem is that this term red line is a often used expression in Israeli political culture. Doesn't mean that much. Obama drew a red line. He said his red line was Iran could not have a nuclear weapon. That's not actually good enough.
So what's at play here? Then what's really happening?
Well, what is really happening is there's a profound disagreement between the United States and Israel about what is enough. For Netanyahu, what is enough is that Iran stop its enrichment to 20%, shut down Fordo, and export its uranium out of the country. And if they don't do that, those are the red lines he wants, then war.
And what about Canada's role in this? Is Canada being used to try and get support for this red line coalition?
No, I don't think there is a red line coalition. There is an argument about where the red line should be. Yeah. And Canada has made its views known, along with France, along with other European powers. They are very much in sympathy with the United States. Iran cannot be nuclear capable, but that's a big gap between where the Israeli government is and where the rest are.
So, Human, I mean, even if it's just
actually, I think it's not. Oh, no, I was just going to say, no, Canada may have that view, but the United States has not said that Iran cannot be nuclear capable. They've just said, Obama has only said,
cannot have a nuclear weapon. Yes.
Some would argue today that Iran is already nuclear capable.
Nuclear weapons capable.
Right here.
The line beyond which lies war with Iran. Many thought Benjamin Netanyahu's message at the UN General Assembly this fall was addressed not so much to the international community, but to Washington.
Netanyahu would like to be able to communicate to the world that the Israelis are ready, which he has, to attack, and that it will be done with the full support of the United States. And he's not getting that.
The tension in the media peaked when President Obama practically referred to Israel's warmongering as noise that he's trying to black out.
Any pressure that I feel is simply to do what's right for the American people. And I am going to block out any noise that's out there.
Pledging full and unconditional support for Israel is part of any presidential election campaign in the U.S. The possibility of war with Iran adds a new dimension to this election season.
The Israelis will attack the Iranians. They will attack. It's just a matter of when. So Americans must decide which presidential candidate can better manage the situation.
Despite campaign bickering,
President Obama has thrown allies like Israel under the bus.
The last debate on foreign policy has shown the candidates hold almost identical views on the issue.
What if the Prime Minister of Israel called you on the phone and said, our bombers are on the way, we're going to bomb Iran? What do you say?
Bob, let's not go into hypotheticals of that nature. Our relationship with Israel, my relationship with the Prime Minister of Israel is such that we would not get a call saying our bombers are on the way.
When I've sent young men and women into harm's way, I always understand that that is the last resort, not the first resort.
Of course, a military action is the last resort.
As far as red lines for Iran,
I understand and share Prime Minister Netanyahu's insistence that Iran should not obtain a nuclear weapon.
My red line is Iran may not have a nuclear weapon. Iran as a nuclear nation is unacceptable to the United States of America.
President Obama said exactly the same thing.
29 standing ovations to the Israeli Prime Minister's speech before Congress, among other things, showed just how powerful the Israeli lobby is in Washington. Despite President Obama's support of a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians, his party members at their convention this fall called for moving the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It remains evident that there is no daylight between the two parties of Israel.
Obama was the guy who gave the impression, with his Cairo speech and others, that he was willing to begin to renegotiate America's policy on Israel and Palestine. But in fact, when it came down to hard political realities, has backed off.
But will he back off when Israel decides to attack Iran?